The summer heat was unbearable as Marcus Williams drove his old Honda Civic down the empty highway. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he rolled down the windows, hoping to catch some cool air. The air conditioning had stopped working 3 weeks ago, and he kept putting off getting it fixed. Money was tight for a college student, even one whose father happened to be the governor of the state. Marcus had always insisted on living like any other young man his age. He worked part-time jobs, drove an old car, and wore simple clothes from discount stores. His friends at the university had no idea who his father really was, and that was exactly how Marcus wanted it. He was driving to visit his best friend Sarah Martinez in the small town of Millbrook County. Sarah had been his study partner in chemistry class, and they had become close friends over the past 2 years. She had invited him to spend the weekend at her family's house, and Marcus was excited to get away from the city for a few days. The drive was supposed to take 3 hours, but he was already running late because he had to work an extra shift at the campus bookstore that morning. The radio was playing soft jazz music when Marcus heard a strange noise coming from under the hood of his car. At first he thought it might just be the old engine making its usual sounds, but then white smoke started pouring out from the front of the car. The temperature gauge was climbing rapidly into the red zone, and Marcus knew he had to pull over immediately. He managed to guide the car to the side of the highway just as the engine made a loud grinding noise and died completely. Marcus sat in the driver's seat for a moment, staring at the smoke rising from his hood. He was in the middle of nowhere with no cell phone service and no other cars in sight. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He had always been good at staying calm under pressure, a trait his father said would serve him well in life. Marcus got out of the car and popped the hood, though he knew very little about car engines. The smell of burning oil filled the air, and he could see that something had definitely gone wrong. After trying unsuccessfully to start the car several more times, Marcus realized he would have to walk to find help. He could see some lights in the distance that looked like they might be from a town or at least a gas station. He grabbed his wallet and phone from the car, locked the doors, and started walking along the highway. The evening air was cooler than the heat of the day, but Marcus was still sweating as he walked. His sneakers were not made for long walks on hot pavement, and he could feel blisters starting to form on his feet. As he walked, Marcus thought about his father and how different their lives were. Governor David Williams was always surrounded by security guards, expensive cars, and people who treated him with respect and fear. Marcus had chosen a different path, wanting to earn his own way in the world without using his father's name or influence. Sometimes he wondered if he was being foolish, especially in moments like this when a simple phone call could solve all his problems. But Marcus believed that character was built through facing challenges alone, not by having powerful people fix everything for you. The lights in the distance turned out to be from a small town called Millbrook. Marcus had never heard of it before, but he was grateful to see signs of civilization. The main street was lined with old buildings and small shops, most of which were already closed for the evening. A few street lights cast long shadows on the empty sidewalks, and Marcus could hear the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the quiet night air. He was looking for a gas station or a tow truck company, but everything seemed to be shut down. As Marcus walked through the town, he noticed how different it was from the city where he went to college. The houses were smaller and older, with front porches and small gardens. Some had American flags hanging from poles, and others had lawn ornaments and flower boxes. It seemed like a peaceful place where everyone probably knew each other and life moved at a slower pace. Marcus had grown up in the state capital, where everything was fast and busy and political. This small town felt like stepping back in time. He eventually found a gas station that was still open, with bright fluorescent lights and a few cars parked outside. The man behind the counter was middle-aged with graying hair and kind eyes. He listened patiently as Marcus explained his situation and offered to call a tow truck for him. The tow truck driver said he could come out first thing in the morning, but there was nothing he could do tonight. Marcus thanked the gas station owner and asked if there was a motel nearby where he could spend the night. The closest motel was on the other side of town, and Marcus started walking again. His feet were really hurting now, and he was tired from the long day. The streets were even quieter on this side of town, with larger houses and more expensive-looking cars in the driveways. These were clearly the homes of the wealthier families in Millbrook, with manicured lawns and security systems. Marcus felt out of place walking through this neighborhood in his simple clothes, but he had no choice if he wanted to reach the motel. As he walked past a particularly large house with a circular driveway, Marcus noticed a police car driving slowly behind him. The car followed him for about a block before the officer turned on his flashing lights and pulled over. Marcus stopped walking and waited as Officer Bradley Thompson got out of his patrol car. Officer Thompson was a large man in his 40s, with a suspicious expression on his face. He looked Marcus up and down, taking in his worn sneakers, faded jeans, and the fact that he was a young black man walking alone at night in the wealthy part of town. Marcus knew immediately that this was not going to be a friendly conversation. He had experienced situations like this before, where his presence was seen as suspicious simply because of the color of his skin. Officer Thompson approached him slowly, keeping one hand near his weapon. Marcus raised his hand slightly to show he was not a threat and prepared himself for another lesson in how the world sometimes treated people who looked like him, regardless of who their father might be. Officer Bradley Thompson walked toward Marcus with slow, deliberate steps. His hand rested on his belt near his weapon, and his eyes never left Marcus's face. The streetlight cast long shadows across the pavement, making the scene feel like something from a movie. Marcus kept his hands visible and tried to remain calm, just like his father had taught him years ago during their talks about dealing with police officers. "What are you doing walking around this neighborhood at this time of night?" Officer Thompson asked in a voice that suggested he had already made up his mind about Marcus. His tone was cold and accusatory, not the kind of voice someone would use when simply asking for information. Marcus could smell the coffee on the officer's breath and see the suspicion in his small dark eyes. Marcus spoke clearly and politely, explaining that his car had broken down on the highway, and he was walking to the motel to spend the night. He told Officer Thompson about the gas station owner who had called the tow truck, and he offered to show him the business card the man had given him. But Officer Thompson did not seem interested in hearing Marcus's explanation. Instead, he interrupted Marcus mid-sentence and demanded to see his identification. "I don't like your attitude, boy," Officer Thompson said as he examined Marcus's driver's license. The word boy hit Marcus like a slap in the face, but he forced himself to remain calm. He knew that any sign of anger or frustration would only make the situation worse. Officer Thompson held the license up to the streetlight, comparing the photo to Marcus's face several times as if he suspected it might be fake. "This says you're from the capital city," Officer Thompson continued. "That's a long way from here. What's a city boy like you really doing in our peaceful town?" The way he said "our town" made it clear that Marcus was not welcome there. Officer Thompson handed the license back to Marcus, but his suspicious expression had not changed at all. Marcus explained again about visiting his friend Sarah and how his car had broken down. He spoke slowly and clearly, making sure not to make any sudden movements that might alarm the officer. But Officer Thompson seemed to be looking for a reason to cause trouble, not listening to anything Marcus was saying. "I've been patrolling this neighborhood for 15 years, Officer Thompson said, stepping closer to Marcus. "I know every family that lives on these streets. I know their cars, their schedules, and their visitors. And I know when someone doesn't belong here." His voice was getting louder now, and Marcus could see neighbors starting to peer out of their windows to see what was happening. The officer began asking Marcus more questions, but they were not the kind of questions that seemed designed to get information. Instead, they felt like a test that Marcus was meant to fail. Officer Thompson asked him to empty his pockets, which Marcus did without complaint. He had his wallet, his cell phone, and a few dollars in change. Nothing suspicious or illegal, but Officer Thompson examined each item carefully as if he was looking for evidence of a crime. "Where exactly is this friend of yours supposed to live?" Officer Thompson demanded. Marcus gave him Sarah's address, which he had memorized before leaving the city. But when Officer Thompson called the address in on his radio, the dispatcher told him that no one by the name of Sarah Martinez lived at that location. Marcus's heart sank as he realized that Sarah must have given him her old address by mistake, or perhaps her family had moved recently. "So now you're lying to me," Officer Thompson said with satisfaction, as if he had caught Marcus in some elaborate scheme. First you tell me some story about a broken-down car, and now you're giving me fake addresses. What's your real reason for being here? The officer's voice was getting angrier, and Marcus could see his hand moving closer to his handcuffs. Marcus tried to explain that there must be some mistake with the address, and that he could call Sarah to clear everything up. But when he reached for his phone, Officer Thompson grabbed his wrist roughly and told him to keep his hands where he could see them. The officer's grip was tight enough to hurt, and Marcus could feel his patience starting to wear thin. I think you came here to case these houses, Officer Thompson accused. I think you were planning to come back later and rob some of these good families while they sleep in their beds. The accusation was so ridiculous that Marcus almost laughed, but he could see that the officer was completely serious. Officer Thompson had decided that Marcus was a criminal, and no amount of explanation was going to change his mind. More neighbors had come out of their houses now, standing on their porches and watching the confrontation. Marcus could hear them whispering to each other, and he could see the fear and suspicion in their faces. To them, he was exactly what Officer Thompson said he was: a dangerous young black man who had come to their safe neighborhood to cause trouble. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Officer Thompson ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. Marcus felt a surge of anger and frustration, but he knew that resisting would only make things worse. He had done nothing wrong, but he was about to be arrested anyway. As the cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists, Marcus thought about his father and how disappointed he would be to see his son being treated this way. Officer Thompson pushed Marcus toward the patrol car, not roughly, but not gently either. The neighbors watched from their porches as Marcus was placed in the back seat of the police car. Some of them looked satisfied, as if justice was being served. Others looked uncomfortable, as if they suspected that something was not right about the situation. As the patrol car drove toward the police station, Marcus stared out the window at the quiet streets of Millbrook. He had come here as a visitor, someone just passing through on his way to see a friend. But now he was being treated like a criminal, arrested for the crime of walking while black in the wrong neighborhood. The irony was not lost on him that his father spent his days signing laws and making speeches about justice and equality, while his son was experiencing the exact opposite. The police station was a small, old building that looked like it had been built in the 1950s. Officer Thompson led Marcus inside, where he was processed like any other criminal. His fingerprints were taken, his photograph was taken, and he was placed in a holding cell with concrete walls and a metal bench. The cell smelled like disinfectant and despair, and Marcus sat on the bench wondering how his simple trip to visit a friend had turned into this nightmare. Hours passed slowly in the holding cell. Marcus could hear other officers coming and going, talking and laughing as if nothing unusual had happened. To them, he was just another troublemaker who had been caught and arrested. They had no idea that they were holding the son of the most powerful man in the state, and Marcus was not about to tell them. The morning sun streamed through the small barred window of Marcus's holding cell, casting shadows across the concrete floor. He had barely slept during the night, lying on the hard metal bench and thinking about how quickly his life had changed. The sounds of the police station waking up echoed through the hallway as officers arrived for their morning shifts. Marcus could hear them talking and laughing, discussing their plans for the day as if yesterday's arrest had been completely routine. Officer Thompson appeared at his cell door around 8 o'clock in the morning, carrying a clipboard and wearing the same suspicious expression he had worn the night before. He unlocked the cell and told Marcus that he would be going to court that morning for his arraignment. Marcus asked if he could call a lawyer, but Officer Thompson just shrugged and said he could talk to the public defender at the courthouse. The ride to the courthouse was short, just a few blocks through the quiet streets of Millbrook. Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car with his hands cuffed behind his back, watching the small town come to life. People were walking their dogs, getting into their cars for work, and opening their small businesses for another day. It looked like such a peaceful, normal place, and Marcus found it hard to believe that he was being treated as a criminal here. The courthouse was an old brick building with tall white columns and wide steps leading up to the front door. It looked like something from a history book, the kind of building where important decisions about justice were supposed to be made. But as Marcus was led through the back entrance in handcuffs, he wondered if real justice would be possible in a place where he had already been judged guilty before his trial had even begun. Inside the courthouse, Marcus was placed in a small holding room with several other defendants who were waiting for their cases to be heard. Most of them looked tired and defeated, like people who had been through this process many times before. One older man told Marcus that Judge Richard Hawthorne was tough on everyone, but especially tough on outsiders who came to Millbrook and caused trouble. When Marcus's name was called, he was led into the main courtroom by a bailiff who looked like he had been working there for decades. The courtroom was exactly what Marcus had expected from watching movies and television shows. There were wooden benches for spectators, a high desk where the judge would sit, and flags hanging from poles on either side. But what surprised Marcus was how many people had come to watch the morning proceedings, as if court was entertainment for the local residents. Judge Richard Hawthorne entered the courtroom with the kind of authority that came from years of being the most powerful person in the room. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look right through people. His black robes made him appear even more intimidating, and when he sat down at his high desk, everyone in the courtroom fell silent. Immediately, Marcus stood at the defendant's table next to a young public defender who looked like she had just graduated from law school. She had introduced herself as Jennifer Collins and seemed nervous about representing someone in front of Judge Hawthorne. Marcus could tell that she was already convinced he was guilty and was just going through the motions of providing him with legal representation. Judge Hawthorne looked down at Marcus with obvious disgust, as if he were looking at something unpleasant that had been brought into his clean courtroom. He picked up the papers on his desk and began reading the charges that Officer Thompson had filed. Disturbing the peace, loitering with suspicious intent, and resisting arrest were the official charges, though Marcus knew he had done none of those things. "So we have another troublemaker from the big city," Judge Hawthorne said in a voice that carried throughout the entire courtroom. "Another young man who thinks he can come to our peaceful community and cause problems for our law-abiding citizens." The judge's words were clearly meant for the audience as much as for Marcus, and Marcus could hear murmurs of agreement from the people sitting in the spectator section. Marcus wanted to speak up and defend himself, to explain what had really happened and how he had been treated unfairly. But every time he opened his mouth to say something, Judge Hawthorne would cut him off with a sharp look or a wave of his hand. The judge clearly had no interest in hearing Marcus's side of the story, and Marcus began to realize that this was not going to be a fair trial at all. "I have been serving as a judge in this community for over 20 years, Judge Hawthorne continued, his voice getting louder and more theatrical. "I have seen hundreds of cases like this one, and they all follow the same pattern. Young men from the city come here thinking they can do whatever they want without consequences. They think our small-town police officers are stupid and our courts are weak." The audience was eating up every word the judge said, nodding their heads and whispering their approval to each other. Marcus could see that this was as much a performance for them as it was supposed to be a legal proceeding. Judge Hawthorne was playing to his audience, showing them that he would protect their community from dangerous outsiders like Marcus. Marcus's public defender tried to interrupt the judge's speech to present some kind of defense, but Judge Hawthorne ignored her completely. He was on a roll now, lecturing Marcus about respect and responsibility and the importance of following the law. But Marcus could tell that the judge's lecture was really about something else entirely. It was about power and control and making sure that everyone in the courtroom knew who was in charge. "You people always have some excuse," Judge Hawthorne said, pointing his finger directly at Marcus. "You always have some sob story about why you were somewhere you shouldn't have been, doing something you shouldn't have been doing. But I have heard all the excuses before, and I am not interested in hearing them today." The phrase "you people" hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had heard those words before, usually from people who were trying to hide their racism behind polite language. Judge Hawthorne was not even trying to hide his prejudice, speaking openly about his assumptions and biases in front of a courtroom full of people. Marcus felt his anger rising for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. He had remained calm and respectful throughout his arrest and detention, believing that the truth would eventually come out and justice would be served. But now he was beginning to understand that justice was not what Judge Hawthorne was interested in providing. As the judge continued his lecture, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He decided to remain silent, not because he was afraid or defeated, but because he wanted to see how far this injustice would go. He wanted to see if Judge Hawthorne would actually sentence an innocent man to jail without even allowing him to speak in his own defense. Marcus's silence seemed to make the judge even angrier, as if he expected Marcus to beg for mercy or admit to crimes he had not committed. Judge Hawthorne's face was getting redder with each passing minute as he stared down at Marcus, who continued to stand silently at the defendant's table. The judge seemed to expect some kind of reaction from Marcus, some sign of fear or submission that would satisfy his need to demonstrate his power over the young man. But Marcus remained calm and dignified, his hands folded in front of him, and his eyes focused straight ahead. "Are you even listening to me, boy?" Judge Hawthorne demanded, his voice echoing off the walls of the courtroom. The word boy sent another wave of anger through Marcus, but he forced himself to remain still and quiet. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom watching him, waiting to see how he would respond to the judge's obvious disrespect. The public defender, Jennifer Collins, tried again to speak on Marcus's behalf, but her voice was shaky and uncertain. She mumbled something about her client's right to explain his side of the story, but Judge Hawthorne waved her away like she was an annoying insect. It was clear that the judge had already made up his mind about Marcus's guilt, and nothing anyone said was going to change his decision. "This court will not tolerate disrespect," Judge Hawthorne announced, standing up from his chair to make himself appear even more imposing. "When I am speaking to you, young man, I expect you to acknowledge that you are listening. I expect you to show proper respect for this court and for the law." Marcus continued to remain silent, not out of disrespect, but because he had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the most powerful response to ignorance and prejudice. His father had taught him that lesson during their many conversations about dealing with people who would judge him based on the color of his skin, rather than the content of his character. The spectators in the courtroom were whispering more loudly. Now, clearly enjoying the drama that was unfolding before them, some of them were shaking their heads in disapproval at Marcus's silence, interpreting it as defiance rather than dignity. Others looked uncomfortable, as if they were beginning to sense that something was not quite right about the way this trial was proceeding. "I have been more than patient with you," Judge Hawthorne continued, his voice rising to a near shout. "I have given you multiple opportunities to explain yourself, to show some remorse for your actions, and to demonstrate that you understand the seriousness of the charges against you. But instead, you choose to stand there like a statue, showing complete disrespect for this court, and for me personally." Marcus's public defender tried one more time to intervene, suggesting that perhaps her client was simply overwhelmed by the proceedings and needed a moment to collect himself. But Judge Hawthorne was beyond listening to reason now. He was caught up in his own anger and the attention he was receiving from his audience. "Let me tell you something about our community," Judge Hawthorne said, pointing his finger at Marcus again. "We work hard here. We pay our taxes, we follow the law, and we respect each other. We don't appreciate it when outsiders come here and think they can do whatever they want without consequences. We especially don't appreciate it when those outsiders show disrespect in our courtroom." The judge walked down from his high bench and stood directly in front of Marcus, trying to intimidate him with his physical presence. Marcus was taller than the judge, but he kept his eyes focused straight ahead rather than looking down at the older man. This seemed to make Judge Hawthorne even angrier, as if Marcus's refusal to be intimidated was a personal insult. "I sentence you to 30 days in the county jail," Judge Hawthorne announced, returning to his bench and picking up his gavel. "Maybe 30 days of hard work and reflection will teach you some respect for the law and for the people who enforce it. I also sentence you to pay a fine of $500, which you will pay before you are released from custody." The courtroom erupted in applause as Judge Hawthorne brought his gavel down with a loud bang. The spectators clearly approved of the harsh sentence, nodding their heads and murmuring their satisfaction. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized that he was actually being sent to jail for the crime of walking, while black in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. Jennifer Collins looked shocked by the severity of the sentence, but she seemed too intimidated by Judge Hawthorne to raise any objections. She whispered to Marcus that she would file an appeal, but her voice lacked conviction. Marcus got the impression that appeals were rarely successful in Judge Hawthorne's courtroom, especially when they involved defendants who looked like him. Bailiff approached Marcus with handcuffs, preparing to take him back to his cell to await transport to the county jail. As the cold metal clicked around his wrists once again, Marcus thought about his father and how he would react if he knew what was happening. Governor David Williams had spent his entire political career fighting for justice and equality, and now his own son was experiencing the very injustices that his father worked so hard to prevent. But Marcus had made a decision to handle this situation on his own, without using his father's name or influence to get special treatment. He wanted to experience what ordinary people went through when they were caught up in an unfair legal system. He wanted to understand what it felt like to be powerless in the face of prejudice and corruption. As he was led out of the courtroom, Marcus could hear the spectators continuing to discuss his case. Some of them seemed satisfied that justice had been served, while others were already moving on to the next case on the docket. To them, he was just another criminal who had been properly punished for his crimes. But Marcus knew the truth about what had happened, and he knew that his silence had revealed more about Judge Hawthorne's character than any words could have. The judge had shown his true nature in front of a room full of witnesses, demonstrating his prejudice and his abuse of power for everyone to see. The county jail was located in a newer building across town from the courthouse. As the transport van drove through the streets of Millbrook, Marcus looked out the window at the community that had rejected him so completely. Children were walking to school, business owners were opening their shops, and life was continuing normally for everyone except him. At the jail, Marcus was processed once again, given an orange jumpsuit to wear, and assigned to a cell with 2 other inmates. His cellmates were local men who had been arrested for various minor offenses, and they were curious about the new arrival who had received such a harsh sentence from Judge Hawthorne. When Marcus explained what had happened to him, his cellmates just shook their heads knowingly. They told him that Judge Hawthorne was famous for giving tough sentences to anyone he didn't like, especially people from outside the community. They warned Marcus that 30 days in county jail would be difficult, but that he should keep his head down and stay out of trouble. As Marcus lay on his narrow cot that first night in jail, he thought about the events that had brought him to this place. A simple car breakdown had turned into a nightmare of prejudice and injustice, and now he was facing a month in jail for crimes he had not committed. But he was also beginning to understand something important about the power of remaining silent in the face of injustice, and about the courage it took to stand up for what was right even when no one else would. Meanwhile, in the state capitol, Governor David Williams was growing increasingly worried about his son. Marcus had called him 2 days earlier to say he was driving to visit a friend, but he had not called since then to let his father know he had arrived safely. This was unusual for Marcus, who was normally very good about staying in touch with his family. Governor Williams had tried calling Marcus's cell phone multiple times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. He had also tried calling Sarah Martinez, the friend Marcus was supposed to visit, but the phone number Marcus had given him was not working. The governor was beginning to fear that something serious had happened to his son. As the most powerful man in the state, Governor Williams had resources that most worried parents did not have. He called the head of the state police and asked him to quietly investigate Marcus's disappearance. Within hours, the state police had traced Marcus's movements to the highway where his car had broken down, and then to the town of Millbrook where he had been arrested. Governor Williams was furious when he learned that his son had been arrested on false charges and sentenced to jail by a small-town judge. But he was also proud that Marcus had not used his family name to get special treatment. The governor knew that his son was trying to prove himself as an independent young man, but he also knew that this situation had gone too far. The governor immediately called his chief of staff and told him to cancel all his appointments for the day. He was going to drive to Millbrook personally to deal with this situation. His security team tried to convince him to send someone else, but Governor Williams insisted on handling this matter himself. Back in Millbrook, the morning court session was continuing as usual. Judge Hawthorne was hearing cases and handing out sentences, clearly enjoying his role as the most important person in the community. The spectators had stayed to watch more cases, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was festive, almost like a sporting event. But then the courthouse doors burst open with a loud bang that echoed throughout the building. Governor David Williams strode into the courtroom with his security detail, his face dark with barely controlled anger. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s who commanded attention wherever he went. The entire courtroom fell completely silent as people recognized the governor of their state. Judge Hawthorne's face went white as he realized who had just entered his courtroom. He had seen Governor Williams on television many times, but he had never expected to see him in person, especially not in his small-town courthouse. The judge's hands began to shake as he tried to figure out why the governor would be there. "Your Honor," Governor Williams said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and barely controlled rage. "I believe you have just sentenced my son to 30 days in jail without allowing him to speak in his own defense." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt, and audible gasps could be heard from the spectators, who had been so supportive of the harsh sentence just hours earlier. Judge Hawthorne looked like he was about to faint as the full realization of what he had done hit him. The young black man he had just called boy and sentenced to jail was the son of the governor of the entire state. The same young man he had accused of being a criminal and a troublemaker was part of the most powerful family in the state government. "There must be some mistake," Judge Hawthorne stammered, his voice cracking with fear and embarrassment. "I had no idea that the defendant was your son, Governor Williams. If I had known, I certainly would have handled the case differently." But even as he spoke the words, Judge Hawthorne realized how terrible they sounded. He was admitting that he would have treated Marcus better if he had known about his family connections, which meant he was also admitting that he had treated Marcus worse because he did not know who he was. Governor Williams stepped closer to the judge's bench, his security detail staying close behind him. "Are you telling me, Your Honor, that you would have handled this case differently if you had known my son's identity? Are you saying that justice in your courtroom depends on who someone's father is, rather than on the facts of the case?" The spectators in the courtroom were completely silent now, realizing that they had witnessed something terrible. Many of them were beginning to understand that they had applauded the unfair treatment of an innocent young man, and they were starting to feel ashamed of their behavior. Judge Hawthorne was sweating profusely now, trying desperately to find words that would save his career and his reputation. But everything he said only made the situation worse. "Governor Williams, I assure you that I treat all defendants fairly and equally. Your son was given the same consideration as any other person who appears in my courtroom." "Really?" Governor Williams replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because from what I understand, you called my son boy multiple times. You refused to let him explain his situation, and you sentenced him to jail for the crime of walking while black in your community. Is that the same consideration you give to all defendants, or just the ones who look like my son?" The governor's words hung in the air like an accusation that no one could deny. Everyone in the courtroom had heard Judge Hawthorne use racist language and unfair procedures, but they had not objected because they agreed with his prejudices. Now they were being forced to confront the reality of what they had witnessed and participated in. Judge Hawthorne tried one more time to defend himself, but his words sounded hollow and insincere. "Governor Williams, I want you to know that I have always been a fair and impartial judge. I have served this community with honor and integrity for over 20 years. "Honor and integrity," Governor Williams repeated, his voice rising with anger. "Is it honorable to sentence a young man to jail without letting him speak? Is it showing integrity to use racist language in your courtroom? Is it fair and impartial to assume someone is guilty because of the color of their skin?" The governor turned to address the entire courtroom, including the spectators who had cheered when Marcus was sentenced. "I want everyone in this room to understand something very important. What happened here today was not justice, it was prejudice and abuse of power, and it should never happen to anyone, regardless of who their father is." Within minutes of the governor's arrival, news crews from across the state began arriving in Millbrook. Word had spread quickly that the governor's son had been unfairly treated by a local judge, and reporters were eager to cover the story. By the afternoon, the courthouse was surrounded by television trucks and journalists asking questions about racial bias in the local justice system. Judge Hawthorne realized that his career was over. The video footage of his racist comments would be played on television stations across the country, and there would be no way to explain away his behavior. He quietly submitted his resignation that evening, but the damage to his reputation was already done. Marcus was released from jail immediately, of course, but the experience had changed him in ways that would last forever. He had seen firsthand how the justice system could fail people who did not have power or connections, and he was determined to use his experience to help others who faced similar situations. The story became national news within days, sparking conversations about racial bias in the justice system and the importance of treating all people fairly regardless of their background. Marcus became a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice, and his decision to remain silent had revealed more about systemic racism than any speech could have accomplished.